The hum of the crowded terminal filled the air as passengers shuffled toward the gate, clutching their boarding passes, rolling bags trailing behind them. Among them was a woman dressed neatly in a tailored navy skirt and a cream blouse that gave her a quiet but undeniable dignity. She walked with steady poise, her leather bag hanging gracefully over her shoulder. Though her steps were calm, her eyes carried the weight of long days, the kind that come from balancing both hard work and responsibility. She didn't glance around nervously like some passengers did. She knew exactly where she was going. When the announcement for first-class boarding echoed over the loudspeakers, she approached the counter and scanned her ticket with a polite smile. The gate agent looked at the slip, hesitated for a second longer than necessary, then forced a smile and waved her through. Her shoes clicked softly against the jet bridge floor as she entered the plane, taking in the familiar smell of recycled air and the faint perfume of leather seats. She walked into the first-class cabin, where a few early passengers were already seated, tucking bags into overhead bins or scrolling through their phones. Her ticket showed seat 2A, a window seat near the front. She placed her bag neatly above and sat down, smoothing the folds of her blouse as she glanced out of the window. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to exhale. The next few days would be packed with events, meetings, and responsibilities, and this flight was her only pocket of silence before the storm. But silence never lasts long when prejudice is nearby. A shadow fell across her as a flight attendant stopped beside her row. The attendant was young, her hair pulled tightly into a bun, her uniform sharp and crisp. Her lips pressed into a line that looked less like professionalism and more like suspicion. She bent slightly, peering at the woman's boarding pass still in her hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said with a pointed sweetness. "This section is for first-class passengers only." The woman looked up, surprised. "Yes, I know. My seat is 2A." She gestured lightly toward the boarding pass. The attendant's eyes narrowed, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "Are you sure? First class is very limited seating. Maybe you're meant to be in the back." Her voice carried just enough volume that the man across the aisle lifted his eyes from his phone to watch. "I'm quite sure," the woman replied gently, though her voice carried a firmness that suggested she had dealt with this tone before. "My ticket says 2A." The attendant held out her hand impatiently. The woman passed over the boarding pass, and for a long moment the attendant studied it, frowning slightly. Everything was in order. The name matched the ticket, the class clearly stated first. And yet, the frown didn't leave the attendant's face. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not her disdain. "You know," she said, "sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes people try to sneak into seats that don't belong to them." The words were a slap wrapped in politeness. The woman's heart tightened, but she refused to show it. She had lived too long to let someone like this chip away at her composure. She met the attendant's stare, calm but unflinching. "This is my seat," she said. The attendant exhaled sharply, straightening up. She forced a smile, but it was brittle. "I'll need to check with my supervisor," she said briskly, walking away down the aisle. A hush lingered around her row. The man across the aisle cleared his throat and buried himself in his phone again. Another passenger, an older woman with pearls around her neck, openly washed with raised brows and a faint smirk, as if enjoying the show. The black woman sat perfectly still, hands folded on her lap, her expression unreadable. Inside, however, her chest tightened, not with fear, but with that familiar burn of being doubted where she belonged. A few moments later, the attendant returned, now with a second uniformed colleague in tow. The two exchanged glances, and the first attendant said, "This passenger claims she has a first-class ticket, but I believe she may have been assigned incorrectly." The colleague glanced at the ticket and back at the seated woman. "It looks valid," she said with hesitation. But the first attendant was relentless. "I've worked in first class long enough to know when something doesn't look right," she said sharply. "Please gather your belongings, ma'am. We'll have to seat you in the back until this is cleared up." The words pierced the air, turning a few more heads. A murmur rippled through the nearby seats. Some passengers frowned, others smirked, while a few shook their heads and turned away. The woman stayed seated, her eyes steady. "This is my seat," she repeated, her voice calm but carrying a steel edge now. "I will not move unless you can show me why my ticket is invalid." The attendant's smile cracked into irritation. "If you don't move, I'll have to call security. The tension snapped through the cabin like static. The very word, security, hung heavy, carrying with it unspoken threats that had become all too familiar in recent years. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, whispering. The older woman with pearls crossed her arms smugly, as though waiting for the spectacle to unfold. The black woman lifted her chin slightly. Her heart pounded beneath her calm exterior, but her resolve held steady. She had worked too hard, lived through too much, to let someone reduce her to nothing with a few words. She opened her mouth, ready to answer firmly, when the captain's voice suddenly boomed over the intercom, announcing final boarding preparations. The attendant glanced nervously toward the front of the cabin, her face pale for a brief moment. The woman held her silence, sensing that something was about to change, though she didn't yet know how. And in that silence, the entire cabin waited, balanced on the edge of what would happen next. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, as though the tension between the woman in seat 2A and the flight attendant had seeped into the recycled oxygen itself. The murmurs from nearby passengers faded into an awkward quiet, the kind of silence that falls when everyone is waiting for someone else to act. The woman sat perfectly still, hands still folded on her lap, her gaze resting on the seat ahead of her. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. Yet her presence radiated a strength that unsettled the flight attendant more than open defiance ever could. The attendant shifted her weight, clutching the boarding pass in her hand as though it were a weapon. Her voice, now sharper than before, cut through the cabin. "Ma'am, I won't repeat myself. You need to gather your things and move to the back. If you don't comply, I'll have security escort you off this flight." Gasps rippled among a few passengers. A man 2 rows behind muttered something under his breath, but quickly hushed himself when the attendant cast a sharp look in his direction. The older woman with pearls smirked, clearly entertained by the drama. The man across the aisle tapped his phone nervously, pretending not to notice though his ears burned red. The woman in 2A finally turned her head, her voice steady, calm, and yet heavy with authority. "You've seen my ticket. It's valid. You have no reason to remove me from this seat." Her tone was not loud, but it carried, calm enough to draw in the curious, strong enough to cut through the prejudice hanging in the air. A younger passenger, seated in economy but watching from a distance, raised her phone subtly, as if to record. The flight attendant's eyes flicked around the cabin, sensing the eyes on her, sensing her control slipping. She leaned down again, this time lowering her voice so only the woman could hear. "Listen, don't make this harder on yourself. We both know this section isn't for everyone. You'll be more comfortable in the back." The words were like poison wrapped in courtesy. The woman inhaled slowly, holding the weight of the moment, then exhaled without breaking eye contact. She did not move. She did not answer. Her silence became its own act of defiance. The attendant, rattled by the refusal, straightened abruptly. Her heels clicked on the cabin floor as she stormed toward the galley, muttering something to her colleague. Within moments, 2 uniformed men, security staff from the gate, appeared at the front of the plane, summoned by her report. The passengers' chatter spiked again, some whispering in shock, others craning their necks to see. Phones were raised higher now, their tiny red lights blinking. The woman in 2A sat frozen but composed, as though she had expected this. The 2 security officers approached her row. One of them, older with graying hair, glanced at the attendant before speaking. "Ma'am, we've been told there's an issue with your seat." The woman lifted her ticket calmly and held it up without a word. The officer took it, studied it, then looked back at the attendant. "This looks fine to me. What's the problem?" The attendant stiffened, her face coloring. "She's not supposed to be here," she hissed. "It must be some mistake in the system." The officer frowned. "But the ticket says first class." "Yes," the attendant snapped, her mask of politeness cracking. "But do you really think?" She caught herself mid-sentence, but the venom had already slipped out, hanging in the air unfinished. Passengers nearby stiffened, and a few exchanged meaningful glances. The younger passenger recording shook her head in disbelief, her phone still aimed steadily. The officer's gaze hardened. He handed the ticket back to the woman, his expression shifting subtly in her favor. "Ma'am, you may remain in your seat." The attendant's jaw tightened, but before she could argue further, a voice rang out from behind. "This is ridiculous. It was the older woman with pearls. She leaned forward, her voice sharp with indignation. We paid for this experience, for peace and comfort. And now we're forced to sit next to. She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone heard the unspoken word. The silence afterward was deafening. The woman in 2A turned slowly toward her, her eyes cool and piercing. You should be careful what you say, she murmured, her tone calm but edged with steel. The older woman huffed, crossing her arms. I said what everyone else is thinking. The cabin seemed to shrink with the tension. The attendant, emboldened again by the passenger's outburst, turned back to the woman in 2A. Do you see? You're disturbing the harmony of the cabin. This isn't about your ticket anymore. It's about the comfort of the other passengers. It was an argument that dripped with false justification, a way to mask prejudice under the guise of procedure. The security officers hesitated, caught in the middle, unsure of whether to escalate or withdraw. The woman in 2A leaned back in her seat, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart pounded. She thought of the years of hard work, the nights spent studying under dim lights, the sacrifices she had made for her career. She thought of the people who had told her, directly and indirectly, that she didn't belong in certain places. And she thought of all the times she had chosen dignity over anger, silence over shouting. This moment felt no different, yet somehow heavier. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some visibly ashamed at the unfolding scene, others too afraid to speak. The younger woman recording finally whispered loud enough for those around her to hear. Everyone is watching. The whole world is going to see this. The attendant's head snapped toward her, but before she could say anything, the intercom crackled again. The captain's voice filled the cabin, his tone crisp and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for departure. Please ensure you are in your assigned seats so we can push back from the gate. Every head turned instinctively toward the cockpit. The security officers exchanged uncertain looks, clearly reluctant to delay the flight any longer. The attendant's face paled slightly, but her jaw remained tight, her pride refusing to bend. She opened her mouth to speak again, to insist one last time. But just then, footsteps echoed from the cockpit. The cabin door swung open, and the captain himself stepped into the aisle, his crisp uniform immaculate, his presence commanding immediate respect. The murmurs grew louder, passengers whispering and leaning forward to see what he would do. The woman in 2A sat still, her face calm, but her heart racing. The attendant froze, caught between authority and the sinking realization that her actions were no longer private. The captain's eyes swept the cabin before landing squarely on the woman in 2A. His expression shifted instantly, his stern face softening into something else entirely. Recognition. Respect. And then he spoke. And with those words, everything in the cabin changed. The captain's footsteps echoed in the hushed cabin as he moved down the aisle, his presence commanding silence. The passengers straightened instinctively, their whispers evaporating into expectant quiet. His sharp eyes swept the rows until they landed on seat 2A. And then, to everyone's shock, the stern line of his mouth softened into a warm, almost relieved smile. "Doctor," he said, his voice carrying clearly, though touched with familiarity. "Why are you sitting back here?" Every head snapped toward the woman in 2A. Gasps rose like waves crashing against the cabin walls. The flight attendant's composure shattered instantly, her face draining of color. She blinked rapidly, as though hoping she had misheard him. The woman in 2A looked up slowly, her calm gaze meeting the captain's. For the first time, a flicker of relief touched her face. "I was told," she said carefully, "that I didn't belong in my seat." The captain's brows furrowed, his expression darkening with a storm of disapproval. He turned sharply toward the attendant. "Is that true?" The attendant stammered, her voice tripping over itself. "See, Captain, I thought there was a mistake. I only meant—" The captain raised a hand, silencing her. He crouched slightly, his eyes meeting the woman's at her level, his voice carrying enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Doctor, you're supposed to be seated in first class. In fact, the airline specifically reserved this section for you. You're our honored guest today." The cabin erupted in whispers, passengers leaning toward one another, eyes wide with realization. The man across the aisle dropped his phone onto his lap, his jaw slack. Even the older woman with pearls sat frozen, her smirk dissolving into disbelief. The captain extended his hand toward the woman. Please, allow me to escort you back to your seat where you belong. Slowly, with quiet dignity, the woman rose. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, her chin slightly lifted. She did not gloat. She did not scold. She simply accepted the captain's hand and walked beside him as he guided her back toward the front row. The murmurs grew louder, some passengers nodding in shame, others whispering admiration. The young woman recording on her phone whispered, "She's the keynote speaker," as if confirming a suspicion. Another voice muttered, "Doctor? She's someone important." The flight attendant stood frozen, her posture stiff, her hands trembling at her sides. The security officers stepped back, clearly uncomfortable with their near involvement. When the woman returned to her rightful seat, the captain helped her settle, then turned once more to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Dr. Elaine Roberts," he announced firmly. "She is one of the most respected surgeons in the country and will be addressing an international medical conference this week. She was invited here by the airline itself as our guest." The revelation thundered through the cabin like a shockwave. The same woman who had been accused of sneaking into first class, who had been told she didn't belong, was suddenly elevated to someone extraordinary, someone revered. The attendant's breath caught in her throat. Her carefully crafted mask of professionalism crumbled, replaced by naked panic. She looked around desperately, hoping for an ally, but every passenger's eyes were fixed on her, cold, disapproving, some even disgusted. The older woman with pearls who had mocked earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact. Her smugness had vanished, leaving only shame. The young boy in the back tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, louder this time, "Mama, why did they say she couldn't sit there?" The mother lowered her eyes, unable to answer. The captain's voice grew sharper, cutting through the whispers. "This behavior is unacceptable. Dr. Roberts has earned her place here, just as any passenger who purchases a ticket has earned theirs. Disrespect of this kind will not be tolerated on my aircraft." The attendant flinched at every word. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead. She opened her mouth, but no excuse would form. All she could manage was a strangled, I didn't realize." The captain's eyes bore into her. "You didn't realize, or you didn't want to?" The silence that followed was deafening. The attendant's lips quivered, but no sound came. She looked at Dr. Roberts, who met her gaze evenly, her expression unreadable but steady. The woman did not speak. She didn't need to. Her very presence, her quiet strength, was enough. The captain finally turned away, adjusting his uniform. "We'll be departing shortly. Everyone return to your seats." He gave Dr. Roberts a respectful nod, then returned to the cockpit. The tension remained thick in the air, but the balance of power had shifted. Passengers who had once looked on silently now exchanged uneasy glances, some filled with guilt, others with admiration. Dr. Roberts folded her hands in her lap, her posture dignified, her expression serene. Yet inside, her chest ached, not from fear, but from the weight of a truth she had known all her life. Even here, even with all her accomplishments, her humanity had been questioned before her worth was acknowledged. The attendant lingered near the galley, wringing her hands, her eyes darting back toward Dr. Roberts. The sting of her mistake burned deeper with every passing second. She had humiliated a woman who turned out not only to belong, but to be someone whose achievements far outshone her own. But the story was not yet over. As the cabin settled and the engines roared to life, the older woman with pearls leaned forward again, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Honored guest or not," she muttered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "she still doesn't belong here. Some things can't be bought with titles." The words sliced through the uneasy calm like a blade. Gasps rose once again, passengers turning in disbelief toward her. The attendant's eyes widened, torn between relief that attention had shifted and dread that the situation was about to spiral further. Dr. Roberts lifted her gaze slowly, turning her head toward the source of the insult. Her face remained composed, but her eyes carried a depth of quiet fire. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her response. And just as her lips parted, the intercom crackled again. A sudden announcement rang out from the cockpit, the captain's tone urgent, cutting through every thought in the room. And what he said next would leave everyone on the plane stunned. The captain's voice thundered through the intercom, urgent and commanding. All crew to stand by. Dr. Roberts, we may need your assistance immediately. The cabin erupted into startled gasps. Passengers twisted in their seats, searching for the source of trouble. Flight attendants froze, their polished masks of composure slipping. The engines hummed steadily, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere tightened like a drawn bowstring. Dr. Roberts rose at once. Her years of training had conditioned her to act before questions. She unbuckled, her calm demeanor suddenly infused with decisive authority. "What's the situation?" she asked sharply, already moving toward the galley. The captain's voice crackled again. "Passenger in row 23, possible cardiac arrest. We need medical attention now." The weight of his words crashed over the passengers like a wave. Row 23. All eyes shifted toward the back of the cabin where chaos had already begun. A man slumped against his seat, his face pale, his chest barely rising. His wife sobbed beside him, shaking his arm desperately. A flight attendant fumbled, panicked, calling for oxygen, her hands trembling. Without hesitation, Dr. Roberts moved swiftly down the aisle. Passengers pulled their knees in, clearing her path. She knelt beside the man, her bag already open, her hands steady. "I'm Dr. Elaine Roberts," she said firmly. "Step aside." The sobbing woman moved back, clutching her hands together in prayer. The flight attendant stammered, "Oxygen, defibrillator." "Bring them now," Dr. Roberts snapped, her focus unbroken. She tilted the man's head, checked his airway, and began compressions with practiced rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her voice counted steady beats, the sound of life echoing through the tense silence. The passengers held their breath, their earlier gossip and judgment forgotten. Every eye was locked on her. This woman they had doubted, insulted, dismissed. Now, in the most critical moment, she was the one holding a man's life in her hands. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she pressed, breathed, pressed again. Finally, with the hiss of oxygen and the shock of the defibrillator pads, the man gasped violently, his chest rising with desperate breath. A collective cry of relief swept through the cabin. Applause erupted, some passengers weeping openly, others whispering prayers of gratitude. The man's wife threw herself at Dr. Roberts' hands, kissing them through her tears. "You saved him. You saved him." Dr. Roberts pulled off her gloves and leaned back, her breath heavy but her expression calm. "He'll need immediate hospital care once we land. Keep him comfortable." She gave precise instructions, her authority unquestioned. And as she rose, her eyes fell briefly on the flight attendant who had tried to banish her. The woman's face was ghostly pale, her lips trembling, her eyes filled with shame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The captain emerged from the cockpit once more, his face serious yet brimming with pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice resonating with deep respect, "you've just witnessed why Dr. Roberts was invited as an honored guest on this flight. She isn't only a world-class surgeon. She's a woman whose hands have saved countless lives. Today, she has saved another right before our eyes." Thunderous applause followed, echoing through every corner of the cabin. Even those who had once smirked, whispered, or doubted now clapped until their palms stung. Tears shimmered in more than one pair of eyes. The older woman with pearls, who only moments ago had spat her bitterness into the air, sat frozen, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. Her eyes darted downward, unable to meet Dr. Roberts' gaze. The very words she had spoken, "She doesn't belong here," now rang hollow in her ears, a haunting echo of her own prejudice. The young boy in the back clapped the loudest, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he said with childlike honesty, "she's a hero." His words carried through the silence that followed the applause, and no one dared to disagree. Dr. Roberts did not smile in triumph. She only inclined her head respectfully, then returned to her seat, folding her hands gently in her lap. Her dignity was unshaken, her presence more powerful than any accusation could diminish. The flight attendant approached her at last, her steps hesitant, her eyes glistening. She stopped just short of Dr. Roberts' seat, her voice trembling. "Doctor, I'm so sorry. I was wrong." Her words cracked under the weight of her regret. "I judged you without reason, and now—" She swallowed hard, her shame heavy. "Now I see who you are. Please forgive me." Dr. Roberts looked up at her calmly, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. After a pause, she said softly, "You don't owe me an apology. You owe one to every person you ever doubted simply because of what they looked like." The words struck like lightning, gentle in tone, but piercing in truth. The attendant lowered her gaze, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. The engines roared louder as the plane began its climb into the sky. Yet inside, the cabin felt changed, almost sanctified by what had just occurred. The passengers, once divided by whispers and prejudice, now sat united in awe and shame, reminded that true worth cannot be measured by appearances. Hours later, as the plane descended and the ground drew near, Dr. Roberts remained silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the window. She wasn't thinking of the humiliation she had endured or the applause that had followed. Her thoughts were with the man she had saved, with his wife's trembling hands, with the breath that had returned to his chest. The plane touched down smoothly, applause breaking out once more as the captain thanked Dr. Roberts publicly before dismissal. Passengers filed out slowly, many pausing to thank her, some with words, others with a nod of reverence. The older woman with pearls avoided her gaze entirely, her shoulders hunched with shame. The man across the aisle whispered a quiet, "respect," before shuffling away. The young woman with the phone lowered it at last, whispering, "The world needs to hear this." And then the attendant approached one final time, her apology repeated in hushed words. But Dr. Roberts only smiled faintly, her eyes kind yet distant. "Let today teach you," she said simply. As she walked down the jet bridge, the hum of the airport returning around her, Dr. Roberts carried herself with the same poise she had when she boarded. But now, every passenger who had witnessed the flight would never forget her. Not because she was a doctor, not even because she had saved a life, but because she had shown the world, once again, that dignity, patience, and truth outshine every shadow of prejudice. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of their hearts, those who had doubted her now carried the weight of their own shame, a lesson that would not easily fade. The story of Dr. Elaine Roberts and Flight 217 had ended in triumph, but its echo remained, a warning, a reminder, and perhaps a beginning of change.